Yeah, that's really awesome.
Go. We are starting. Wait. Make sure this is on the speaker because it records better.
Aren't you guys usually on here?
Yeah, I know.
We
Maybe
on the wrong side.
we usually be, I always wonder, well, how? We used to be over there. We switched.
They're all waiting.
We used to sit there, no.
Good morning.
Good
Good morning, class. We're all in our places with bright smiling faces. Good morning. Well, welcome to Contemporary Issues again today. What a good turnout. Nice to have you all here. And today we're going to talk about, Ron Puning is going to do a presentation on a book review of this book about Rust Belt economics and populist appeals. And so Ron will explain to you that it's by a former Trump White House advisor, but it will have good relativity to us about lots of things going on in the world today, not just America, but about how there's populist movements across the world. And so be applicable to lots of things, so that will be fun. But before we start, our usual announcements. Those of you on Zoom, welcome. Hope you can see and hear us okay. I believe we're all connected today, so that is good. And please mute yourself in the lower left corner of your screen. And we are recording this for future playback, so your sharing will be preserved for posterity. Do you want to share comments? And let's see, a few other announcements. Our Sunday school class party, all are invited. It's December 12th at 6 o'clock. I will send out an email again at the Galloway's house in Centennial, I think. It's not too late to sign up online. I'll send out the email and it'll have a sign up genius there to sign up for your side dishes. If you want to bring something, you can sign up there. And if your side dish is already filled, you can still
Just come and bring something.
just come and bring something. Right, good idea. We'll provide the meat and drink, and there'll be trivia contest and ugly sweater contest, and so it'll be fun. It's a fun way to.
Cute sweater contest.
Yeah. You what?
Cute sweater
Cute
contest.
Oh, there
sweater?
you go.
Oh, well, you guys won last time we did this.
And we had cute sweaters.
You did have cute sweaters. That's right.
He's the designer, so you've got to give him.
I don't know if that's a good thing. I'm an ugly sweater contest, I'm the designer.
No, the cute sweater. We had
Oh,
cute
okay.
sweaters.
Okay,
I
we might-
object to the ugly sweater. It should be beautiful sweater, because I like those sweaters.
you,
The
yeah.
best.
Okay, also want to recognize, say hi to Susan from Toronto, who's usually on Zoom with us. So Susan is here in person this time, so nice to have you. Nice to
Lead us
have
in a chorus of "Oh Canada."
Yes, our good friends from the north. Yeah.
Right. Lots in the news we can talk about. We want to give Ron plenty of time, but boy, this Omicron variant is a scary thing. And Afghanistan is crumbling. Banks are closing. The headlines say Afghanistan near collapse economically. There's signs and wonders in the sky and foreboding going on in the world, but we must have hope. I'm quoting from the sermon today. We must have courage and hope and optimism because we can solve our problems.
Are
Okay.
we not sponsoring an Afghan family? Could someone tell us about that?
Jim, I can tell you about that because I'm the chair of that committee that's doing going to be matched this coming week with an Afghan family that will go into an apartment that we've already furnished in Aurora. And so we have a committee of about 14 people so far, and you can join that if you want to. And we will be helping them, mentoring them with things that they need, helping them get adjusted to American life. And so there's at least 2,000 Afghans coming to Denver alone
Wow.
from their.
How many?
2,000.
Mm.
And same or in bigger cities across the country too. So, yep.
But
we're
we
glad-
don't have a family yet, is that correct?
In this coming week,
Okay.
keep you updated on that. Okay,
On an upward note, University of Michigan did beat Ohio State yesterday, and those of us who are Go Blue are very happy about that.
We have to say it's only the second time, only the second time in 10 years, so.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, let's.
Context.
Uh-oh,
Yeah,
rivalries
maybe
here.
Context around it.
Right.
Also for that.
Sports rivalries going on. Okay, Bill, did you have something?
Well, I should welcome my son, John from Raleigh to North Carolina. and his
Hi, John.
wife.
Good, nice to have you here. Thank you. You've been here before, Carl.
Yes.
I remember too. Nice to have you both here. Okay,
I'll try to be quieter this time.
that's okay. No, we encourage questions and comments, so that's what we're here for. Okay, any other thoughts before we start? Okay, Ron.
Okay, today's lesson, of course, is based on Fiona Hill's book. Fiona, of course, testified at the first impeachment trial of President Trump, former President Trump. And the title of the book, "There's Nothing for You Here." And that quote came from Fiona's dad when she grew up in a poor section of Northern England, which we'll see in a few minutes. Okay, so with that, let's get going. Move it down to the next. Oops. That should bring it. Okay, Steve was looking at the internet and found a nice interview where Fiona sits down for a good 20-25 minutes with on firing line, talking to, this is former US President Hoover's granddaughter, if I'm not mistaken, Steve.
Herbert Hoover's
And
granddaughter.
it's a great interview, so you may want to write down that YouTube address if you'd like to listen to Fiona a little bit more. So with that, let's move
She
on.
has a weekly TV show on PBS called Firing Line, and it's very good interviews.
All right. Well, England, a much smaller country than us. Of course, Great Britain consists of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England per se. And it's a very polarized country, just like we are politically. You find the London area just down here. It's very advanced. It's evolving well to accept the new economic realities, whereas the older parts of Upper England that are heavy in coal mines, steel mills, shipyards, things like that, are having tough time of it. We call that the Rust Belt of the United Kingdom. And just like we're having troubles with our Rust Belt, they are having struggles in that area of their country. But Fiona was a coal miner's daughter. She had very humble beginnings in in England. She was born in '65 in a town called Bishop Auckland. Yep, that's two names. And there used to be a bishop who lived in Auckland, and that kind of gave the town its name. It was a coal mining town with, I think, a small steel mill, but primarily the coal mining. And the last mine closed more than a decade ago. So it's gone through very rough times. She ended up working her way out of this poverty. We'll go through that story a little bit. Ended up in the John F. Kennedy School of Harvard and ended up on the as an advisor to the National Intelligence Council and made it into the Trump White House as an advisor on affairs with Russia and was a national intelligence analyst. She met her husband, Ken, who's a native of North Dakota, I believe, and married him and they were both in their early 30s, so that she had kind of a late marriage, as did her husband. And she, of course, ended up in the United States, is now a citizen of the United States, and has been so for a couple decades.
Ron,
Yeah.
excuse me, I forgot to share screen so that the folks on
Oh.
Zoom can see
Oh,
it. So
yeah.
let me go ahead and just do that real quick. And it'll be on the recording too. That way. Otherwise, they're looking at Jim.
Thank you.
They do.
Thank you.
He's so sweet.
There we go.
All right.
There you go.
All right. So on the slide, there's a picture of the Castle Auckland, where the Bishop of Auckland lived many hundreds of years ago. And I've also got a scene from My Fair Lady. One thing Fiona mentions is UK, like most nations, has very powerful class-oriented segregation and structures. And your language, your accent in Britain very much gives away what part of the country you're from. And if they detect this heavy Northern England accent, whatever name it has, I won't call it a hillbilly accent, but it was,
Cockney or something.
yeah, it was highlighted in My Fair Lady. You remember, for those who saw that, she had this horrific accent that put her and immediately got her characterized as someone from the poor side of town. See if we can move it on here. Okay, the key concept of the book is, and she stresses this, opportunity does not materialize from thin air, and nobody does anything alone. So it's a kind of takeoff on the phrase, it takes a village. Barriers to opportunity are personal and universal, and any individual success is a team or collective effort. That is the focus of our book, although we'll see some other themes we're going to work on today. Let's get on to the next one.
Well, where'd you catch it?
Okay, so again, she had a tough childhood. She talked about visiting her grandparents in the 70s, and her Granny V had crippling arthritis, and her granddad had Parkinson's. And they lived in a little row house. Talk about a tough time. The row house had no modern conveniences. It didn't even have indoor plumbing. It had a little stove in the center of the room of the unfloored first floor. And she would collect coal as a granddaughter, put it in that coal stove and get it going to try to create some heat for her poverty-stricken grandparents. And the house had a tiny fridge, but it wasn't a fridge like we think of it. It was chilled with ice blocks. It was
Ice
literally an ice box, and it had a bare floor. There's a picture taken quite recently that shows some of the row houses there in Bishop Auckland. So you get an idea of the kind of community. It's not the Cherry Creek of England. So her mom was June and her dad was Alf, not the one from the TV show. But her dad was a coal miner. He literally lost his job as a coal miner. She said the 1950s looked pretty good in England as they were coming out of the war. But she said over a 30-year period after 1960, the industrial manufacturing in the UK shrank by more than 2/3. So they lost over 2/3 of their industry, which is the largest deindustrialization of any Western country, worse than us, Russia, France, anybody. Her mom was a hospital-trained nurse, and that really helped, and was a midwife. And her mom acquired this job when the father lost his job as a coal miner. She said right after World War II, the British National Health Service was formed, and it was a social leveler. It provided a lot of jobs in England and helped them survive. She did say that the employment of both of her parents enabled them to buy a small semi-detached house, 1964, And she said, no one in her parents' direct line of descent had ever owned a house prior to that. So, yeah. Definitely,
And yet she rose to work in the White House.
yeah.
Mhm.
Poverty. Fiona was born in 1965 and her sister Angela in 68. And Fiona's mother, June, had to leave her job after the second child arrived to take care of the kids. And they had to survive on their dad's income. He got hired as a hospital porter, just to help her around the hospital. And their annual income was $17,500 in today's dollars. So a family of four, they weren't rolling in the money, let's put it that way. She said the runaway inflation between 75 and 78 made things worse. The family had to cut off its electricity to make it to the end of the month and queue up in the bread line sometimes. And Fiona had homemade clothes. She talked about embarrassingly having to wear clothes made from curtains to school. That reminds me of,
Coat of many colors.
yeah,
Data sacks.
yeah.
Scarlet, it sounds like Scarlet O'Hara.
And of course, UK had a raging heroin epidemic in the 80s and 90s. But she said, although in Bishop Auckland, alcohol was the choice drug. So how many remember the song by Johnny Rivers, The Poor Side of Town? Yeah, I was going to play that today, but we'll wait and play a couple songs next week. She said she talked about her elementary school. At the end of elementary school, you took a test. In fact, there were several levels of tests in England where you took tests and you kind of got pushed into different career paths. And roughly at sixth grade, she had to take a test. The higher scores got to go to secondary school, and it wasn't that many. It wasn't more than 50%. It was a minority. She said her mom scored fourth in her elementary school class on the test, but they only took the top three girls. So her mom didn't make the cut years before. She was a very, obviously Fiona is and was a very smart woman. And she made it. She made the cuts, all the cuts. But so she did get to go to one of the better schools. She mentions that this testing was so intense, so often. She said, if you messed up the test in sixth grade, it could set you back for life. There weren't that many opportunities to get out of the rut you'd fallen into. So she said, if you were a poor sixth grader and you didn't get much help from your folks, didn't score real high on the test, you were kind of finished before you were started. Fiona did get into a good elementary school called Etherley Lane and had a top-notch headmaster, she said, who kept the school at a top caliber, really worked hard to try to get that little elementary school. She finished first in her class on the 11+ test. This was late at high school, and received a scholarship offer from a private school called Durham High. But her family, even with the scholarship, didn't have the resources for her to accept the full tuition scholarship. They didn't have the money for the books, the equipment, the transportation. They didn't have a car to get her there. And she said her parents, trying to help her, bought a used set of encyclopedias on monthly payments, used, to try to help her out a little bit. But so she and her sister ended up at a local school called Bishop Barrington from 1977 to 84. She said there were insufficient books there, and they had the goalpost of one of their soccer fields and a place on the field that literally collapsed one day. And it was a mine underneath, the cave in, and the goalpost disappeared. Fortunately, there wasn't a game going on when the goalpost swallowed. Okay, so she's not a kid with a silver spoon in her mouth. Fiona also mentions some of the struggles of her youth in terms of not only the poverty, but she talked about a tremendous sexist culture in that area of Britain. She talked about, she was warned to look out for the lecherous lads and dirty old men. She said there was very little social outrage to getting flashed at, groped, or molested unless it was a violent attack. Shirts were pulled up, hands stuck in your underwear common. Girls learned to stick together, associated only with a trusted circle of male friends, and tried to avoid guys they didn't know. Later in college, she gets a job, a part-time job working as a waitress in a pretty uppity, a real nice Royal Golf Club. And there, one of the golfers stuck his hands up her pants, and she elbowed him and told the manager, you know what happened? The manager let her go and put her on a blacklist, recommending that other people didn't hire her. So sexist problems were worse in that area of Britain than they even are in some areas here. So it was a tough time. Okay.
Painting a wonderful picture of England.
Yeah, the poor side of town, yeah. So she ended up getting exceptionally high grades, and she tries to, I mean, really top grades. And she goes to take an interview to try to get a scholarship to Oxford. And they put you through, she said, an interview. It was kind of almost a social screening. They would ask you questions, use words and phrases that you wouldn't be familiar with. And she said the kids from the poor areas, even if they had excellent academic credentials, would usually get knocked out by the interview because they weren't familiar with the what I call the better side of town phraseology and all this stuff. She said before 1974, only 16% of the students at Oxford were females, and the kids that got in there were really the products of some of the really top-notch British prep schools, almost all guys that had been prepped, sometimes even went to an extra year of school, just taking prepping for the interview and for the entrance exam. But she did bad on the interviews. The technical words, college terms she hadn't been exposed to. But fortunately, she did get to go to a fallback school, a college called St. Andrews. So our name shows up again.
There we go.
Okay, let's move this slide bar down.
That's where Prince Harry met his wife Meghan.
Oh, okay.
Oh, really? Yeah, they both attended there.
Okay. So she gets accepted at St. Andrews, and in fact, gets to go to the Soviet Union in an exchange program in 1987 and 88. She studied to study abroad at Moscow's Marie Storace Institute of Foreign Languages, funded by the British government. And she had a good 2-year period where she got to live in the Soviet Union in the Moscow area for a couple of years. She said in 1991, the Soviet Union saw devastating levels of unemployment and poverty as the state collapsed economically. And let's move on. She was there around 1987, when President Reagan made the famous speech, "Tear down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev." She again goes over the class distinctions, emphasizing that they would ask you 3 questions when somebody met you in Great Britain. They would ask you, where'd you go to school? What area did you grow up? What's your parents' occupation? And of course, they could know your gender. And they kind of quickly put you in a place. And of course, they recognized your accent. They used your accent also as a. She said, whereas in the US, we have much less of that. But she said over here, race is one of the big factors that people use to class you, judge you, and put you in a certain class. She mentions in the 1990s, there was intense turmoil in Russia, Eastern Europe, and North England. Most of us don't realize how significant a turmoil there was in Russia at this time. Millions lost their jobs. It's a state transition from a state-controlled economy to kind of a free enterprise system. They kicked out all the state pension plans and state programs, threw thousands out on the streets, unemployed. They still prioritized their defense spending for health care at that time, creating a humanitarian disaster. She said some of the more remote Russian cities lost more than 20% of their population, and smaller towns even 50%. And masses of Russians moved towards Moscow. Moscow was like London, one of the more prosperous areas of the Soviet Union that was managing the transition from the old economy of steel mills and coal mines to a modern economy. Okay, a parallel to the US. This is a map of the US Rust Belt areas, and the reds and orange signify areas according to really high loss of manufacturing jobs. And you can see where Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Upper New York, Ohio, Michigan have a lot of red, brown scarred areas. And some of those areas, again, you can read those charts, 43, 58% of the manufacturing jobs lost in some of those areas. Got a couple pictures here. There's the Mosler Safe Plant in Hamilton, Ohio. It's completely gone.
We drive by there.
Yeah.
We go visit family.
And that was the largest maker of safes in the world. This is a picture of the Portsmouth, Ohio area with all the smokestacks and steel mills, shoe factories. There's no more steel mills, shoe factories, or anything else there. So
Ron, this is Doug. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, Harvard manufactured trucks, and literally over a period of about 2 years, they closed the facility, and the unemployment dropped 10,000 people in that town of, in that town of 250,000 people.
So for those of you who have traveled back through Ohio, Michigan, and at least gone into certain areas, you'll get a real exposure to some of it. It truly is a rust belt in many areas.
And what is the green?
The green is actually places that have made substantial gains in manufacturing. And that looks like North Carolina.
Yeah.
Certainly.
There you go. Yeah.
And Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia. A lot of the manufacturing jobs moved south. Okay, the big divide. So the younger people tend to leave the hollowed out post-industrial regions that they can. And generational racial diversity has become increasingly uneven. Generally, they say places with little diversity are more likely to be Rust Belt and economically deprived areas. Our generation, the baby boomers, are 82% white. By 2045, the country will be majority minority. In other words, if you lump all the minority categories together in aggregate, they will constitute a majority. People feel cultural despair, sense of loss, grievance, and anxiety as the community shifts around them. And this creates what Fiona called cultural despair. Folk are easy prey for those who promise to put jobs, people, or countries back in their rightful place. So people in Rust Belt areas are looking for a savior, and they're more vulnerable to people that offer promise. Okay, in 2019, the UN appointed a Professor Austin to do a study of both the United Kingdom and America. And he came back with his findings, and this is reasonably recent, 2017, 2018, 2019. And Professor Austin said that much of the glue that has held British society together since World War II has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos. And the experts say that about 1/5 of the UK lives in poverty. 14 million people. So
Is that as of now?
As of now, yeah.
Wow.
And he came down in his report and he said yes, the British system was providing a lot of healthcare, and they still do, healthcare, but a lot of other benefits, and pulled them out under the more austere conservative government. And he said the place is hurting and suffering.
Ron, question about that. Is that because of the post-industrial and causing a lot of people carry, I call them used to haves?
Yeah,
You know what I mean? Used to haves.
used to have, yes. Yep. They're having a struggle, as we are, trying to find jobs for people in places like Akron, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Toledo, many of the Ohio cities are having struggles. Cleveland.
And you don't see this when you watch news bits on TV about Great Britain.
No.
This is not what they show.
No, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor Alston noted about 30 million are living in relative poverty in the US. That's what, 10% of our population of over 300 million. US is unlike other Western European countries. It does not envision access to healthcare or basic housing as a right. And statistically now, the US is less socially mobile than almost any other developing country. When we say social mobility, that's the ability to fight and work your way out of the lower quintiles of economic prosperity and move on up. Fiona hits hard on what we can do and what caused it. She talks about the education deficit and how Britain has a different set of situations. There's some pretty good books on the subject. She said the working English children classed as white British, I'll call them white trash British, but they're discriminated and disadvantaged because they're poor and because they live in economically ravaged areas devoid of opportunity. She said even within London, there's a differentiation, and it's largely based on your educational attainment.
Like little Oliver Twist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember that book?
Yeah.
The Brexit. This is a plot that shows the voting on Brexit, and blue means you voted for staying in the European Union. The red means you voted to get out of the European Union, and you can see how polarized the UK is. That northern sector up here is Scotland. So you can see what Scotland said, no, we don't want to break out of the European Union. And you can see the wealthy areas, the more prosperous, economically reformed and advanced areas of London were for staying in the economic union. But they had thought that the British would stay in the European Union, but they badly underestimated what the poor folk would do in the Rust Belt areas of England. And you can see that the red areas, the poor areas of England, swung very strongly to Boris Johnson's more conservative position, get out of the European Union. Rise of the populist. Populists are, there's no simple definition. The essence, though, of what a populist is typically a charismatic leader who claims to embody the will of the people against the elites. And there's different things they call the elites, or people they call, but they often appeal to fear and enthusiasm in the population to enhance their own power. Populist movements harnessing public anger are usually unable to propose and implement effective solutions. I have seen in a lot of the poorer white small towns, white dominated small towns in America, people saying, the government hasn't done anything for us. We've lost our industry. There's no real future here for us young men. And very, very angry. The government hasn't done anything. But then they'll turn around if somebody starts spending, saying, well, we need a program, and they'll bitch like crazy about spending government money. to try to cure it. But generally, the populists often oppose political structures and say they want to forget the House of Representatives and the Senate. Let's just change things. The people is often represented by only a tribal segment of society. So the populists will often appeal to a given niche of people, their tribe, and it's also often based on socioeconomic class, religion, or race. And it often creates an anti-democratic tribal club and starts quickly getting into an us versus them. Us is good, the them is the elites or whatever, however you define elites, and them is bad. And we're seeing that happen around the world in many, many countries. And we give, I think on the next slide, we give an example. Let's see, I need to move it on here. Come on. We'll see examples where populist movements are rising very strongly in Brazil, Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and I won't go into all the details. And of course, Putin is very much a populist. And so
Ron, is it all kind of the same type of populism, the same appeal to?
Yes, we find the commonalities. Bolsonaro down in Brazil says we need more guns. There'll be no abortion. Poland, encouraging anti-immigrant, total intolerance of LGBTQ, creating laws to allow them to fire and hire broadcasting chiefs at Poland's radio and TV station. Abortion, already banned in Poland, was to be further eliminated by discarding rape and incest as an inclusion. So, yeah, we see commonalities, tremendous commonalities. The turn to right-wing populism. It's happened in England. In 2019, the town of Bishop Auckland, where Fiona grew up, for the first time voted for a Conservative member of Parliament for more than 100 years. So it's throw out those liberals and in our country, Democrats. Let's embrace this conservative populist movement. So we certainly saw it here. Fiona points out, though, that Trump is a good example of what often happens with populists. Not always, but often. They end up focusing on themselves. They think they are the people's champion, and people thought that Trump would bring back coal mines, steel mills, and he would take care of the rural folks who believed the Democratic Party had abandoned them. But I think the record shows that it didn't happen. John Bolton, in his book, said, Trump obsessed all 4 years about himself and how others were treating him, and said, quote, this is page 485 of his book, I'm hard pressed to identify any Trump decision during my tenure that wasn't driven by re-election calculations. So again, there's been some good populists, and not every aspect of populism is bad, but and we're seeing in the world today quite a few populists come up that are turning it into a me instead of a we thing. Okay. The Kremlin joins the fray. Putin worked on his government to get himself, change the rules so he can be leader at least through 2036. And he also changed some of the rules, had him change the Constitution to give him more power. He did interfere in the US elections. Russia hired droves of young Russians who spoke English to pose as Americans on the internet, Facebook and Twitter, and stir up controversies on gun control, race, religion, and other topics. Stir the pot. They fanned the distrust of public servants and US government, and Fiona says Trump simply could not distinguish between Russia's broad-based attack on the American election and his own position and ego. Okay, so Fiona ended up in the White House. She was interviewed by KT McFarland, a Fox News program host, and was offered a position with the U.S.-Russia Foreign Relations Committee. So that's how she got
Where
in.
was she living at the time that she was interviewed?
In, U.S. She
Here?
had come to the U.S. She had gone to Harvard and got
Oh,
this
okay.
degree, had married an American,
Okay.
but she had an uncommon amount of knowledge. She also wrote the book on Putin around 2012. There's a book out there, and she was well known for writing about the only Western biography on Putin that explained a lot about how he thinks and how he operates. Okay. All right. Well, if you're a Trump fan, you're not going to like the next couple slides.
It's all right, let it rip. Let it rip.
So here we go.
Interesting.
I think we're there.
Right.
Yeah, we got that one.
Now we want to know what she thought.
Let's go back. So we're going to look at about 3 slides that are her, what I call observation of what she saw in the White House.
Ron, before we get into that, could I ask what she says about the impact of the international wage market? You know, we're in a competitive world labor market, and that has moved our manufacturing industry to China.
Okay, I don't think the book explicitly gets into that level of detail in terms of precise causes of the Rust Belt and the globalization. Okay, let's see if I can move along here. Let's see, we're past there. Where was I? It's up in the White House. Okay, notes on Trump. Okay, so here's a couple slides on. She says, "Here's what I observed when I was in the White House." She said Trump repeatedly stated he didn't consider the people or the states that had not voted for him as part of his America. Again, it's the us versus them. We the people was for Trump, me the people. He said throughout the presidency, America was at war with itself, including inside the government. And here's a quote that's gone on to a lot of the national news services. Fiona said, "The political machinations around the Trump White House turned out to be as dirty and filled with intrigue as the Kremlin." She said it was a dog eat dog. Many of the Trump appointees were a motley crew of people with few ties to each other and some with no prior government experience whatsoever, all jockeying for influence and often launching assaults to oust perceived enemies from their position. She said it was a man's world. Said he was extremely sexist. She said Ivanka set the tone. Ivanka would also often dress in the super high style, and what few women there were in the White House like her were kind of cast aside. Fiona said, "I wasn't, I'm not good looking." And it was pretty clear because I wasn't, a supermodel or dressing in the latest fashion that I didn't count much. She said he was an incredible self-centered egotist. He said individualistic to the point of being obsessed first with himself and then his family, was selfish to the core and had the most fragile ego of anyone I encountered to date. So the Trumps never apologized for anything large or small. He said apologizing is a sign of weakness. She said even the whole concept of an autonomous advisory board was foreign to him. He knew everything he needed to know. From his orbit, from his staff, and everyone who came into his orbit, Trump demanded constant attention and adulation. The president's vanity and fragile esteem were a point of acute vulnerability. He was a liability to himself and his country. Anyone could influence him by deploying nothing more than basic flattery in public. Said he could easily be moved and manipulated. Okay. Populist commonalities. She said, looking, around the world. She said she observed a pattern in the U.S. Groups of people latching onto conspiracy theories and refusing to be swayed, no matter what contrary evidence was presented. She observed a hyper-personalized populist presidency where national security interests were set aside for partisan political purposes or personal gain. She observed how the US, the UK, Russia, Brazil, and India resembled each other in their failure to mount a well-coordinated response to COVID. All these places, posturing populist politicians drowned out scientific experts. And all three of these countries, US, UK, and Russia, all found themselves with hollowed out areas and rust belts. And from these regions, it fed populism, authoritarianism, undermined democracy, and each country wanted a strong man to fix things up. Okay, we'll just about stop there.
But it's interesting because fix things up. We both grew up in Ohio, so we go back. My dad still lives there. Yes, we're big Ohio State fans, all that good stuff. But it's interesting when you say they want someone to fix it. I take that to mean we want someone to take us back 25, 30 years ago to the good old days. And they are, I'm so excited. I hope it really happens with the infrastructure bill that they get internet access because it's very limited. And we didn't grow up in an off the grid part of Ohio at all.
Where in Ohio?
We're just south of Toledo, Bowling Green.
Small farm town.
Small farm town, 2,500 people. But you grew up the east side of Cleveland, so
Totally different than that.
totally different, true. But when we go back there, because we can work, we have no internet access. It
At
makes
his house.
at my dad's house.
He can't even get the New York Times.
Oh yeah, I tried to get the New York Times there. He doesn't have a computer. He's 92, so I'll give him that. But I tried to get a weekly delivery of the New York Times. When I couldn't do a daily delivery, I tried a Sunday delivery. No,
So the infrastructure is
the
there.
infrastructure just needs a lot of support.
Okay, which sets the scene. I'm going to quit talking here. We're going to stop here. Part two is the what do we do about it? We're going to be getting into next week.
Yeah, we planned this transition, right?
Exactly. What do we do? Fiona gives some very strong recommendations. Some of those things are starting to happen. But we'll talk about the multitude of things that have to be done to try to attack this. If we decide as a nation we want to attack it, some just want to say, "Oh, let's just forget about it."
Let's just all get along.
Yeah.
But that's all part of, let's go back to
Of course it is.
20 or 30 years ago to,
Right,
you
of
know.
course.
Is that what Rodney King says?
Yeah.
Can't we just all get along?
Yeah.
Something like that?
Leave it alone and it'll take care of itself.
One little side thought I had as you're talking about strong men and populist appeal is the lawyer on TV ads here in Denver that's called the Strong Arm.
Oh, yeah.
And he just runs ads all the time, and it's his appeal. I think it's his appeal of being a strong arm for the working person. I'm gonna fight for you as the strong arm that's gonna make things right for you.
Yeah.
It's just another example of populist appeal, I think.
Just as an observation, I believe there are a couple of different types of Trump supporters. I'm a Trump supporter of his policies.
Yeah.
Not necessarily his personality of egotism and so forth. And there are some people who don't like him because of his personality, and who cares what his policies were? I just don't like the man, and they vote against him. And then, yeah, it's just an observation.
Good point.
Okay.
Jim.
I was 8 years old when World War II ended, so I don't remember an awful lot about it, but I do remember that my parents always listened to 15 minutes of news from Alex Dreyer in the morning and 15 minutes of news from Ed Murrow in the evening. And that was the extent of our news coverage. There was no television, of course. And I'm so overwhelmed by the 24-hour news that exists now. Fox, CNN, MSNBC, and all the other agencies that are constantly bombarding all of us. And it seems to me that the internet and the news coverages and all of the other access that populist people have works to their extreme advantage.
Yes.
And to true leaders to their disadvantage. Because true leaders will try to say things that are true, that are accurate, that try to give their constituents good information, whereas populists don't care about the accuracy or the truth. What they're interested in is creating emotion and following. And but I remember that 15 minutes in the morning, and that was the greatest conflagration that Earth had known, probably even since that time, was World War II.
Okay.
Are you opening it up for questions now, or do you have?
Yeah.
Thank you. You helped answer a question that Mary and I had last week on BBC. The reporter indicated that Scotland had the highest rate of drug addiction and opioid abuse of any country in Europe. We said, well, why the Scots? Hardworking, industrious people that they are. You helped answer that question in part, and also began to think in terms of because of the clan structures, et cetera, and so forth. West Virginia, in American history, the Scots really populated Kentucky, Southern Ohio,
Carolina.
oh, right in that area. In fact, the music, some of the language, practice, and so I have Scottish derivatives. And again, the Hatfields and the McCoys, the fighting, the Hatfields and the McCoy, began to think in terms of comparisons of Scotland and West Virginia and the so-called Rust Belt area. There's some interesting comparisons. You got us thinking about some of that. One factor that's been left out too is the use of religion. Putin has recently rediscovered religion. He has found religion.
Really?
And the Orthodox Church. Right. No, and he is utilizing that, the deep history, all the symbolism, all the significance of Mother Russia. He's found religion. But how populists will use religion oftentimes to get that kind of solidarity and certainly speak to that tribal culture that they're wishing to cultivate. So I think you've got us all thinking here. But the similarities, to what's going on in Europe as well as in this country.
Yeah, the leaders of Poland and Hungary, particularly, the Hungarian leader is really pushed, looking at their nationalism, and bolstering up the Catholic faith. Yeah, really.
Okay.
Aren't there, it seems to me that when bringing up the religious aspects, it seems to me that those who grew up in more authoritarian, religious environments where you look to the figurehead in your church or the figurehead of your whatever, and you don't ask questions, you do what we do what we always do, you memorize what we tell you to do, that those may be more easily led than those backgrounds where more, it's okay to ask questions. You're not going to be ostracized from your church if you are open and ask questions. It seems to me that tends to lend itself to more populist or authoritarian
Absolutely.
leaders. Okay, good point. Yeah. And can be manipulated.
Yep.
That way.
Yeah.
just a generalization,
Yeah.
Right.
and I realize
People,
Yeah.
many people are trained from birth
that. Right,
with very strict
yeah,
religious classes to fall right into.
that's right.
If they can be pushed into a religious dogma
Right.
with extreme loyalty, they can also be pushed into a political.
Yeah.
The
And
two
don't
go
think for
hand in
yourself.
hand.
Do what we've told you, don't
Mhm.
think for yourself. Yeah.
Mhm.
So is Putin pushing the Orthodox, that side of Christianity? Is that where he's?
Eastern Orthodox, probably, Ron.
The Russian, there's a Russian Orthodox
Russian
church.
Orthodox, Russian Orthodox,
Oh, there is. Okay.
Russian.
Which is
I'm sorry,
an offshoot, of early Catholicism with more of the
Constantinople.
rituals and icons and things like that.
Mhm.
So I have a question that kind of arises out of this cultural analysis that I hear Fiona talking about. One is, we mentioned that the more populist oriented people tend to get the more liberal perspective doesn't come through.
Mhm.
What is it about that segment of the population that they don't get disillusioned when their own party doesn't come through? What is it that they hate so bad about liberalism that keeps them from not getting disillusioned with their own party? I think that's an interesting question.
It is a good question.
They don't want to know.
I don't have the answer,
It is a good
and I
question.
doubt if anybody in this room has the answer.
But we all wonder.
But we wonder, what is it?
Sometimes if you feed people cultural issue things that they really feel strongly about, we're going to give you the right to have automatic weapons wherever you want. We're not going to let those jerks push you out of church and stop you from going to church.
No more baby killing.
No more baby killing. And you work on those issues strong enough. And it's, yeah, you got them.
Okay,
You can do
Lydia
just
was
about
had
anything.
a question. She had her hand up.
Well, being an educator, I went through the era of No Child Left Behind.
No child left behind. Oh, love.
And boy, you had to learn the facts. And every test was black and white, the facts, no creative thinking, no critical thinking. And that was in about 2000.
Right.
You know, who was president then. And anyway, I think that's what's happened to some of our millennials now. They went through that era.
And that's why critical race theory is such a hot button too.
Yes.
That's a critical analysis. You're right.
But I really think that when kids don't have the opportunity in education to think critically or creatively, and they only have a choice of yes or no, or black or white, how do they approach the election?
Yeah.
How do they approach their
Life.
job? Yeah, life.
Yeah.
Religion, whatever.
Good question. Yeah, Ron and I are smiling because we're going to do a class soon on critical race theory, what it is, how widespread it is.
You wait till after the first, we're gonna be gone.
Sure, we're gonna do that. And then our other fun one is gonna be marijuana and CBD. We're gonna do a Sunday on that.
You guys are
Yes,
getting really
Melinda.
edgy.
Yeah.
In response to Ron's question, that you almost have to distinguish between social issues and economic issues. And I think that the people that we've been talking about are driven more by their fear of the very social issues
Mhm.
than they are by their own economic
Yeah.
requirements and status or whatever. And that's why populism continues to rise, because they have this fear of immigrants or fear of progress, because it might take them in an area where they are not familiar, or, you know. So I think it's more social.
Ron, was populism always driven, let's say, must have occurred in the 1800s and some in our history?
Well, it's happened throughout the ages,
Was
yeah.
it driven by the far right? Is it always driven by the far
No,
right?
there's been populist from both
On
sides.
the other side.
And not every populist has been a bad populist.
Mhm,
There's been some populists that have turned out quite good.
mhm.
I know I did the great course on the Roman Empire. There's two great courses. And Cicero in particular, whom we have more Roman writings from than any other Roman, particularly stressed, he said, when you're dealing with people and you're trying to argue a case, appeal to their emotions.
Right.
So facts and all those stuff, you kind of get, dig in and appeal to their emotions. Get them fired up, get them, reach them. We're on these social issues and you'll carry the day. And I couldn't help as I read that book. Wow.
If Bernie Sanders would be considered a
Yes.
populist in
Yes.
a benevolent,
Yeah.
more benevolent as
Right.
opposed to.
And a lot depends on who you call the elites that you hate. Some people say, well, the elites is senators of the opposing party that you don't like. Some say the elites is college professors.
That's a good point.
They're snobbish, they're, leading everybody astray. The elites could be industrial leaders or billionaires. You can form all kinds of different pockets of elites,
All the,
as the enemy, the thems.
Okay.
we
one
are
last
past
thing.
time. We are gonna take another question or comment or two, and then we gotta go.
Okay,
But
now,
Ron, a Methodist minister gave me, well, in a sermon, a great lesson on emotion. He said, whenever your logic and your emotions conflict, obey the logic because the emotions will let you down. And when you think about that in various situations, it's true.
Anybody else on Zoom want to make a comment before we go? Okay,
okay, just one last thing.
yes, sir.
Fiona's observations are her perceptions. And
Yes.
when I read something of any book about anybody else, I always have to put in the back of my mind that that is their perception. And that's maybe their bias a little bit, one way or the other, doesn't make any difference. And so in her mind, her perception is reality to her. And my perception is real to me. And Lola's perception is real to her. And we all have perceptions.
And Trump's is real to him.
Right,
And-
right.
And justified, yes.
So I always have to put that whenever somebody, whoever, who it is,
Yes.
I have to think, okay, that's their perception. And is it real or not real, or how true is it, or how false is it? And I always have to try to keep it open-minded.
Okay, good point.
So again, next week, we're gonna continue, although it'll be less political in that, in terms of focusing on distinct politicians. But next week, we'll look at, okay, what do we do about this? What are some possible solutions? Will they work or won't they work? Should we ignore some of this stuff? Or how should we attack the Rust Belt problem and the problem? We'll show the inequality. One chart we'll show next week shows that 70% of the wealth of America is in the hands of 10%. 10, and we'll show the charts. We'll show some pretty good charts that show how we're getting more inequality. And this is factual charts that we'll see. And then we'll ask, what do we do about it, if anything? What are some of the possible remedies? Yeah, it should be a good one.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank
Great
you.
discussion. Thanks, everybody. See you next week.
Okay, I'll see you next week.
Okay.
So much amazing weather. But I think, right, the way you know,